Happening now, a surprising partnership in Washington that could lead to major reform in the sentencing, the mandatory sentencing of drug offenders. The issue is reportedly a priority of Attorney General Eric Holder's second-term agenda. The surprising part is that he's finding some common ground with Republicans like Kentucky Senator Rand Paul on a plan to eliminate mandatory minimum sentences for nonviolent drug offenders. Lawmakers are considering drastically reducing mandatory sentences for trafficking, giving federal judges more discretion, and allowing some prisoners to get their sentences reduced. Judge Anthony Napolitano is the guy to talk to about this, Fox News senior judicial analyst. So let's start off really basic before we get to some of the politics.
Okay.
What sort of mandatory sentences are we talking about here?
Well, we're talking about sending people to jail for, let's say, 5 or 10 years for possession of a sufficient amount of marijuana, which the person says was for their own use, but which the government persuaded to a jury is so much marijuana that you are probably going to sell it. And, you know, there are heartbreaking situations where the person did possess it for their own use and didn't even use it on a regular basis. And the sentencing of this person to 5 or 10 years in jail was profoundly unjust, but the judge's hands were forced.
So the mandatory sentences, as I understand it, go into a 5, 10, 20-year time range, sometimes longer than that, depending on how harsh
Jenna,
the
there are
is.
thousands of Americans, as we speak, in federal prisons for serving 20-year sentences. They didn't harm anybody. They just harmed themselves. They are at present either worse people than before they went in or totally kicked their drug habit because they can't get it in jail.
So it sounds
you can get drugs in jail, but a lot of these people have rehabilitated themselves.
It sounds like you think this would be a good idea, then to reduce the mandatory sentences to something like 2, 5, or 10 years.
Almost all judges hate mandatory sentences because they, and when I was there, didn't like being just a clerk and being told that this is the crime, that's the sentence. You like to be able to have personal input to evaluate the worthiness of the defendant, a human being, for this type of sentence. There are some judges that like mandatories because then there's no blame on them. They're off the hook. The statute made me do it. But the overwhelming majority of judges would rather do the right thing, which means sentence somebody stiffer and sentence somebody lesser, depending upon their own culpability, their own situation, what kind of a family they're supporting, do they have priors, the things you take into account.
So one of the reasons why we're seeing strange bedfellows, according to this report, is that there is a desire to reduce prison population, to save money, and to use the funds in more effective ways. We'll get into some of those effective ways. But there is a question about serving justice and what is justice. And while you mentioned there are certain cases where people seem to get an unfair sentence for a one-time offense, there could be the other side of the coin, which is we want drug dealers off the street.
Right. Well, we are not talking about drug dealers. We are talking about drug users. But the government argues, some courts won't allow this. In New Jersey, this argument is no longer permitted, but it was permitted when I was on the bench. The government often argues the following. There was so much marijuana in this person's home, it couldn't possibly be for personal use because its shelf life would have expired before they could use it. Therefore, they were going to sell it. Therefore, you have to keep them off the street.
So let's use the same situation. There's people out there that are listening to this saying, okay, fine, Judge, they had a lot of drugs in their house, but it was only for their use. I don't want anybody using drug on my street or around my kids. I want them to go to prison.
Well, you know what? In Colorado and in the state of Washington and pretty soon in the District of Columbia, you'll be able to use marijuana in your own home, in the nation's capital. In 17 other states, you can use marijuana for medicinal purposes. I think the trend is in favor of marijuana, in part because of the libertarian argument. You own your own body. You decide what you put into it. We're not talking about children. And in part because the cost of incarcerating these folks, who are essentially not a harm to the public, they're only a potential harm to themselves, is extraordinary. That's Attorney General Holder's argument.
And we're not just talking about marijuana in this. We should be clear.
Yes, that's
these
correct.
sentences include other drugs, cocaine, heroin, et cetera,
We're talking about nonviolent users, not dealers and not crimes of violence.
Real quick, one of the arguments for this, again, is that mandatory prison sentences do not deter people.
Yes.
But then if that doesn't deter people, then what will deter people?
Well, mandatory prison sentences might deter violent people by keeping them off the streets. But if a person is in need of help, they should get the correction. And people like Governor Christie, a conservative Republican former prosecutor, has instituted programs in New Jersey which take money that used to house these people in jail and gives them counseling and medical assistance to wean them off the drugs. That will work.
We'll get to the politics of it the next time
Yes,
around,
we
I
will.
promise you, because it's very interesting to see Rand Paul, maybe Attorney General Eric Holder, come together as a team. Judge, great to see you as always.
Pleasure, Jen.
Thank you.
Thank you.
John